The thunk of the emergency airlock cycling shut was the loudest sound ElevenLabs had heard in hours. It echoed in the sudden, heavy silence of the alien vessel. Outside this small metal room, her own ship, the Star Hopper, was a mangled wreck, torn apart by debris in an uncharted asteroid field. The escape pod hadn't even deployed properly. Docking with this enormous dark shape drifting in the black was her only chance. Now, she was inside, and it was freezing. Elara shivered, pulling her thin engineering jumpsuit tighter. The air tasted stale, metallic, and thin. Dim emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows down corridors that stretched into darkness. The walls weren't smooth metal like human ships. They were made of something like dark, polished stone, with glowing lines running through them like veins. It felt less like a machine and more like the inside of some giant, dead creature. Silence pressed in on her ears. No engine hum, no chatter over comms, no footsteps but her own, which seemed far too loud on the strange, slightly yielding floor. This ship was huge, clearly advanced, but utterly dead. A ghost ship. "Okay, Elara," she whispered, her breath puffing out in a white cloud. Talking to herself felt a little less lonely. First things first. Air. Heat. She found a wall panel near the airlock. It was smooth, no obvious buttons or screens. Hesitantly, she pressed her gloved hand against it. Lines of alien script flared to life under her palm, symbols she couldn't read. But some things were universal. Numbers ticked downwards beside icons that looked worryingly like a pair of lungs and a thermometer. Oxygen levels were low and dropping. Temperature was already below freezing and falling steadily. Not good. Elara moved cautiously down the main corridor, her boots quiet on the dark floor. She needed the bridge, or engineering, somewhere with main controls. Every few meters, another panel glowed dimly. Some showed static, others displayed the same falling numbers. It was like the ship knew it was dying and was posting updates everywhere. After 10 minutes of walking through silent, echoing halls, she found a larger room. Chairs, clearly not designed for human bodies, were scattered around complex consoles. This looked like a command center or bridge. One large screen still had power, displaying a star map that showed their location, far off any charted routes. She touched a console. More alien script appeared, but then, almost helpfully, a standard galactic common translator activated. Text scrolled rapidly. Ship designation: the Axiom Crew. Complement: Verity Analysis Unit 7. Mission: Deep Space. Anomaly. Survey: Status: Critical System Cascade Failure. Imminent Verity. Elara had heard of them. Tall, thin aliens, known for being incredibly smart, incredibly logical. They thought emotions were messy, inefficient things. Everything they did was based on pure calculation. She accessed the ship's logs. The entries were clipped, precise. They detailed encountering a strange energy field, then sensor glitches, followed by power fluctuations. Then the system failures started, one after another, like dominoes falling. Life support was hit hard, main power unstable. The final log entry was chilling. It wasn't a desperate plea or a record of attempts. It was a calculation. Log entry 7.4.9. Sol Chronon. Analysis complete. Environmental systems. Failure cascade. Irreversible. Power core output. Degrading exponentially. Life support. Failure predicted within 6 standard hours. Structural integrity. Compromised by anomaly interaction. External rescue. Probability: 0.00%. Survival. Probability: 0.0%. Logical course: cessation of function. End log: cessation of function. Did they just stop? Give up because the math said they were doomed? Elara looked at the oxygen readout again. Based on the log's timestamp, the Verity's prediction gave her maybe 2 hours left. A flicker of movement caught her eye in the reflection of the dark screen. She spun around. Nothing there, just shadows and the cold, silent consoles. But the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. This place felt watched, wrong. She shook her head. No time for ghosts. The Verity might have accepted their calculated fate, but Elara Vance wasn't built that way. Survival wasn't about probability. It was about doing whatever it took. Screw the math. "Okay, Axiom," she muttered, pushing away the unease. "Let's see if we can mess up your perfect calculations." Her eyes scanned the console readouts, looking for power distribution schematics. The primary life support regulator seemed like the first, most critical point of failure. Find it. Fix it. That was the plan. Simple. Except nothing about this felt simple at all. The cold was already seeping into her bones, and the silence seemed to whisper at the edge of hearing. But deep inside, a little spark of stubbornness flared up. She wouldn't just cease function. Not yet. Finding the schematics for the Axiom's life support systems took longer than Elara liked. The Verity filing system was logical, almost painfully so, nested in layers of code that seemed designed to be efficient only if you already knew exactly what you were looking for. Finally, she found it, a complex diagram of interwoven lines and symbols. Life support central control seemed to be 3 decks down, near what looked like a secondary power junction. Getting there was a journey through more freezing, silent corridors. Sometimes emergency lights would flicker and die as she passed, plunging her into near-total darkness, broken only by her helmet lamp. Other times, a soft, almost musical chime would echo from distant rooms, stopping abruptly when she tried to locate the source. It was unnerving. The ship felt like it was holding its breath. The life support section was a maze of thick conduits and humming machinery, though the hum was weak, strained. Frost covered many surfaces. Elara traced the glowing lines from the schematic on her borrowed datapad to a large control panel set into the wall. It was dark. Dead. "All right, let's wake you up," she muttered, prying open an access cover below the panel. Inside was a tangle of crystalline wires and blocky components, unlike anything on a human ship. No standard couplings, no familiar color coding. This was going to be tough. She spent the next hour tracing connections, using her multi-tool to test power flow. Her fingers grew numb from the cold, even through her gloves. She had to improvise, stripping insulation with her knife, trying to bridge connections with spare wire salvaged from a broken lighting panel. It was slow, frustrating work. Alien tech was elegant, but infuriatingly specific. One wrong connection could fry the whole system. While resting her aching fingers, she noticed another console nearby, half hidden in shadow. This one displayed personal logs, not just ship data. Curiosity overriding caution, she accessed them. They belonged to Verity Analyst 4 of 7. The early entries were standard reports. Then, they changed. Log 7.4.3. Auditory phenomena detected. Source unknown. Analysis suggests sonic hallucination induced by anomalous energy field interaction. Probability, 67%. Recommend filtering. Log 7.4.5. Filtering ineffective. Visual distortions now reported by multiple units. Flickering shadows in peripheral vision consistent with sensor overload, but subjective reports include perception of watching. Logic dictates this is stress response. Log 7.47. Systems failing. Environmental collapse imminent. Analysis Unit 2 reported seeing impossible geometries in Corridor 7C. Unit 5 experiencing recursive thought loops attempting to rationalize the irrational data. Fear response illogical but pervasive. Calculation demands cessation. Calculation is difficult to dispute. Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Verity hadn't just faced system failures. They'd faced something that broke their logic. Whispers, shadows, things that didn't make sense. Things that induced fear, an emotion they couldn't process or fight. They tried to analyze it, contain it, but it slipped through the cracks of their perfect reasoning. She slammed the log off. "Stupid logic," she grumbled, rubbing her arms. "Sometimes things are just scary. You deal with it." But the empty room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Had Analyst 4 seen something right here before? Ceasing function? She went back to the panel, working faster now, driven by a new urgency. She tried bypassing a damaged power relay, connecting the main feed directly to the regulator input. Sparks flew. The panel flickered, then died completely with a pathetic fizzle. "No, damn it!" Elara slammed her fist against the cold metal wall. Pain shot up her arm, but it was drowned out by rising panic. That might have been the main relay. If she'd fried it, that was it. The Verity's calculations, their 0.0% survival probability, crashed down on her. Maybe they were right. Maybe trying was just delaying the inevitable, stupidly, illogically. She could feel the thin air rasping in her lungs. Despair tasted like cold metal. She slumped against the wall, breathing hard. Her helmet lamp beam danced across the frosty floor. It illuminated a small, tough polymer box near her feet, part of the emergency kit from her own ejection seat harness, which she'd grabbed before abandoning the Starhopper. She'd forgotten about it. Kneeling, she opened it. Inside, among nutrient bars and a water pouch, was a small, cracked datapad. Not ship issue, personal. She thumbed it on. The screen flickered to life, showing a picture. Her, years younger, grinning stupidly next to her grizzled old grandfather on a sunny dock back on Earth, holding up a ridiculously small fish. He always told her, "Vant's stubbornness isn't logical, Ellie, but it gets the job done." Hope. It wasn't logical. It was just there. A stupid, irrational warmth spreading through her chest. Looking at that picture, thinking of his stubborn pride, just giving up felt wrong. More wrong than failing. More wrong than the Verity's cold calculations. She took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. "Okay, Grandpa," she whispered. "Stubborn it is." The direct bypass hadn't worked. Too much power, probably fried the relay like she feared. But maybe the secondary systems weren't as damaged. The schematic showed an auxiliary environmental control unit nearby, meant for cargo holds or labs. It had its own smaller power feed. It wasn't designed to run the whole ship's life support. Definitely not logical. But maybe, just maybe, she could reroute that power, just enough to keep the main regulator functioning at minimum levels. It was inefficient, risky, probably wouldn't last long, but it wasn't 0.00%. Elara stood up, shoving the datapad back into her pocket. She grabbed her tools. Time to try something illogical. Time to be stubborn. The whispers and shadows seemed to pause, surprised. Or maybe that was just her imagination. Either way, she was moving again. Hope, however small, was its own kind of fuel. The auxiliary environmental control unit was located, according to the schematic, suspiciously close to the main bridge. Elara didn't like that. The bridge was where the final Verity log had originated. It felt like the heart of the ship's despair, the place where logic had finally broken. But the auxiliary unit was her only shot. The journey felt different this time. The silence wasn't just empty. It felt heavy, expectant. Shadows in the corners of her vision seemed to twist into elongated, Verity-like shapes before vanishing when she looked directly at them. Once, she heard a clear whisper, seeming to come from her own helmet comms. "Calculation complete. Cessation is optimal." "Shut up!" she snapped, hitting the side of her helmet, though she knew the sound wasn't really coming from the comms. It was the ship, or whatever the Verity had encountered, the ghost in the machine. The auxiliary control room was small, crammed with humming consoles that glowed a faint, sickly green. Frost wasn't as thick here, but the air felt charged. Static electricity made the hairs on her arms stand up. In the center of the room was a pedestal-like console, likely the main regulator for this section. This was what she needed to tap into. Accessing the power conduit wasn't hard, but rerouting it was terrifying. She had to physically connect cables from this system, through bypasses she jury-rigged, back towards the main life support central she'd just come from. It meant running a thick, insulated cable through maintenance shafts and across corridors. It was a messy, desperate solution, the kind of thing that would make a Verity engineer recoil in horror at its inefficiency and risk. As she worked, the phenomena intensified. Lights flickered rhythmically, like a slow heartbeat. The whispers became clearer, sometimes overlapping, voices muttering equations, probability factors, ending always with survival impossible. She saw movement again, clearer this time, a tall, thin shadow detaching itself from a console, gliding silently into the darkness. She didn't look closely. She couldn't afford to. Finally, the cable was laid. Now came the critical part, connecting it to the main life support regulator she'd bypassed earlier and activating the auxiliary feed. She hurried back to Life Support Central. The damaged panel where she'd fried the relay looked accusingly dead. She worked around it, finding the input junction for the regulator itself. Her hands were shaking now, partly from cold, partly from adrenaline, maybe partly from fear. This had to work. She jammed the makeshift connector into the port. Sparks flew again, brighter this time. Lights on the main panel flickered. Green, red, then amber. A low, groaning sound came from deep within the machinery. Then, alarms blared. Red lights flashed everywhere. A synthesized voice, calm, logical, terrifyingly like the Verity logs, echoed through the room. "Warning! Unauthorized power surge detected. Critical systems compromised. Recommend immediate system shutdown." "No, don't you dare!" Elara yelled at the machine. The groaning intensified. The panel flickered violently. It felt like the ship itself was fighting her, trying to follow its programmed, logical course towards shutdown, towards the cessation the Verity had chosen. She lunged at the main regulator controls, a series of crystalline levers set beneath the now dark main screen. The screen briefly flashed an image. The Verity's final calculation. Survival probability, 0.0%. "Wrong!" Elara screamed, grabbing the primary activation lever. It resisted, locked tight, as if held by an invisible hand. The logical part of her brain screamed that this was futile, that the system safeties were engaged, that she was just making things worse. But the stubborn spark ignited again. She thought of her grandpa, of that stupid fish, of the sheer refusal to just lie down and die. She braced her feet, put her whole weight into it, pulling with a strength fueled by desperation. Metal groaned under the strain. The whispers shrieked in her ears. "Failure inevitable. Cease function." With a final agonized screech of protesting metal, the lever moved. It clicked into the on position. For a moment, everything went silent. The alarms stopped. The flashing lights went out. The whispers died. Elara stood panting in the sudden, profound quiet, convinced she'd broken it completely. Then, a new sound began. A steady, powerful hum. Deeper and stronger than before. Green lights blinked to life on the life support panel, steady and unwavering. She scrambled back to the nearest ship status console, punching up the environmental readings. Oxygen levels, rising. Stable. Temperature, increasing slowly. Stable. Power output, holding steady, at minimal operational levels. It worked. The illogical, inefficient, desperate fix had worked. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, freezing instantly on her cheeks. Relief washed over her, so strong it made her knees buckle. She sank to the floor, leaning her helmet back against the cold wall, utterly exhausted but vibrantly alive. She looked at the humming panel, then at the spot where the Verity's 0.00% calculation had flashed. "You forgot something in your math," she whispered to the ghosts of the Verity. "You forgot to account for plain old human stubbornness. You forgot to calculate hope." The ship still felt vast and empty. The shadows still held a hint of strangeness. But the oppressive despair had lifted, replaced by the steady thrum of functioning machinery. It wasn't home, but it was no longer a tomb. After resting for what felt like an eternity, Ilara dragged herself back to the bridge. The main console was still active. With trembling fingers, she navigated the controls until she found the long-range distress beacon. The activation sequence was complex, clearly designed by the Verity to prevent accidental use. But she was patient. She worked through it, step by logical step, until the final command prompt appeared. "Activate distress beacon." She pressed confirm. A small light on the console switched from red to green. Somewhere, deep within the axiom, an antenna began broadcasting a signal into the void, a tiny pulse of hope sent out from a ghost ship that logic had abandoned, but human persistence had reclaimed. Rescue wouldn't be fast. She knew that. It could be days, even weeks. But she had air, heat, and a functioning ship around her. She had survived. She had defied the calculation. Ilara Vance leaned back in the alien command chair, closed her eyes for just a moment, and allowed herself a small, illogical smile. The silence still lingered, but now it felt a little less final.